Welcome to the Intimate Marriage Podcast, where I teach educated, successful couples how to have incredible, passionate relationships so that you can stop compromising and start feeling fully alive in your relationship. I'm Alexandra Stockwell, aka the Intimacy Doctor. I'm a physician, a relationship and intimacy coach, and I'm an intimate marriage expert. My husband and I have been married for 26 years. We have 4 children and full professional lives, and we've created an amazing marriage. I've shown hundreds of couples how to do so as well. So if you want to deepen your understanding of your own relationship and learn to access new heights of emotional, sensual, and erotic intimacy, you're in the right place. I will show you how. Now, let's dive in. I'm thrilled to welcome Connor Beaton to the show. He is the founder of ManTalks, an international organization focused on men's wellness, success, and fulfillment. Connor is a coach, facilitator, teacher, podcast host, and speaker, helping men, which of course then means helping everyone. But anyway, helping men from all over the world find purpose, healthy love, a joy-filled life, and fulfilling sexual connection. His teachings draw from an in-depth apprenticeship in Jungian psychology, Gestalt, cognitive behavior therapy, and both Buddhist and Taoist traditions. He has a no BS approach coupled with compassionate understanding of our human limitations. And your bio goes on because you've done so many incredible things. And I'm really grateful to have you here with your expertise and your humanity. So welcome to the Intimate Marriage Podcast, Connor.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. And it's so weird hearing our bios sometimes, you know? It's like, yes, interesting. Yeah.
Well, what do your friends know about you that isn't in the bio? Or let's say, what does your wife know about you that isn't in the bio? Because it doesn't say anything, but you are married, right?
I am. Yeah.
And I know you have at least one child.
Yeah, we have one boy. He's 2 years old.
Okay, lovely.
My wife is a phenomenal marriage and family therapist. What does my wife know about me that's not in the bio? I mean, I rode motorcycles for almost a decade, I guess a little bit more than a decade. Was a little unruly, you know, did street racing, which was illegal, and stunting, which was also illegal. So like pulling wheelies and stoppies and all kinds of weird and wild stuff on my motorcycle. And then
that's amazing. That's like the perfect combination of ivory tower training and street cred.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Okay, I really love that. Well, I've come to learn that sometimes my guests are surprised that I just skip the foreplay, skip the preamble, but I'm going to do that now and ask you a question. Actually, before I ask the one question that I prepared, will you share why you do this work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of 2 reasons that I do this work. One of them is very personal, and the other one is relational. You know, I do this work in part because I bottomed out at some point in my life and hit a rock bottom. And before I had done that, you know, my life looked very much on paper what I thought it should look like as a young man. You know, I had the motorcycle, the Mustang. I was traveling the world for my career. I had this wonderful relationship and all these great things going for me. And behind the scenes, what people didn't know is I was lying and I was cheating and I was struggling with porn and abusing substances. And it was just, you know, I was completely out of control. And so, you know, those 2 parts of me came into a collision course and imploded my life. relationship ended. I left the career that I was in, and I had carried so much shame and also pride that I didn't want anybody to know, and so I moved into the back of my car for a few weeks. And eventually, when I came out of that, connected with a mentor. My previous career was in music, and so when I came out of that, I connected with a mentor who was in his early 70s, and he sort of took me underneath his wing and really helped me. And we started talking and working together. And he was trained in Jungian psychology and CBT and a bunch of other areas. And
Wait, do you mind just defining CBT? I am so glad for how diverse my audience is. There are many professionals, many physicians, and many people who would say, wait, is that cannabis, CBT? What is that? So will you just go ahead and define it?
Cognitive behavioral therapy, not cannabis. Although today that's
they actually are not as, the gap between them is not as big as it used to be.
That's right. So cognitive behavioral therapy, sort of changing the cognitive patterns that we live with, the narratives that we live with, the belief structures that inherit our mind. But the big part was Jungian psychology, a lot of shadow work, working. It was interesting, like working with the anima and the animus. But anyway, the main point is that I spent about 2.5 years with him, and it was a real life apprenticeship, like an old version of education, where I chopped wood and helped with his asparagus farm. And in turn, I paid him when I could, but I was pretty broke, and working as much as I could. And and then he taught me, and he became my sort of mentor. And so that's one of the reasons. And the other reason, which I'll sort of keep brief, is when I came out of this rock bottom moment, I started to connect with the other men in my life and sharing with them what had been going on and what had transpired in my life. And there was a conversation with a close friend of mine where I shared what had been going on, the lies and the infidelity and all the stuff that I hadn't been telling anybody. And at the end of me sort of sharing everything with him, there was this silence, and he paused and, sort of broke down, and then told me that he had tried to commit suicide about a month and a half before. And I was really struck in that moment by how much I knew about him and how much he knew about me, but neither of us knew the depth of our struggles. We sort of knew all of the surface level stuff, the scotch we like to drink and the TV shows we like to watch and all that kind of stuff. And so that kind of sparked something in me, because as I shared more and more with the men in my life, vulnerability begets vulnerability in some cases. And what I started to realize was how most of my male friendships were lacking in depth and substance. We sort of talked about the usual stuff, but we weren't talking about the meaningful and important questions and pains of our life. And so that sort of sparked this purpose or mission that I wanted to explore at some point. And it wasn't until years later that I would do that. But those two things really put me on this journey.
Thank you for presencing them. I want to get to how men can open up, both with other men and if they're in a heteronormative, long-lasting relationship with their woman, in a way that isn't the way women do it, isn't emasculating, isn't going against a sense of strength, while creating the genuine depth of connection that you've just described. I have that question, but I have a related question before that, which is, how did you find yourself in an apprenticeship? How did you find a mentor? And I'm not asking so much, unless you want to share that, but my question isn't logistical. It's not like, did you meet in the grocery store? Did someone say, hey, you should talk to that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, how did you go from moving through life in what actually is a very typical way. Maybe there are many people who aren't as successful as you were, but with a kind of disconnection, I'll just say. And then to find yourself willing and able to craft a mentorship relationship, because the couples that I work with, I think, I don't want to say all because I can't be certain about that, but certainly most of the men would love to have a worthy mentor in their lives, but how to go from where they are, both within them and to find somebody. I mean, I guess the answer finding someone is this is a service you're providing now, but there's an existential shift that needs to occur to be ripe for a mentor, particularly for a man. Would you speak to your process or what you've learned guiding others in doing that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very valuable question. I'm going to sort of speak about two parts. One is initiation, and then two is my sort of personal openness. But initiation in many ways, which has sort of been stripped from our Western culture, was meant to do a couple primary things. One of which is to help bring a man into contact with power and powerlessness. And so Richard Rohr, who's this Franciscan monk, has this great quote about, until a man is brought on a journey of powerlessness, he will always abuse power. And so I think many of us men just haven't experienced what it's like to be put in a position of healthy powerlessness. Some of us have experienced uncontained powerlessness through abuse and trauma and, violence and those types of things. And
a general feeling of a lack of agency and sovereignty in life.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
because you're saying those kinds of traumas, I'm thinking actually going through medical training is something that creates a sense of powerlessness, which typically wouldn't be considered a trauma, but it functions in that way. Or being in the military for 20 years, same thing.
Right. Because those are contained, right? There's structure around them. And, so I think many of us many of us as men, and I felt this as a young man as well, tended to avoid being in this sort of not necessarily submissive position, but certainly a junior position where there's somebody else that has a certain potency and level of power and agency in your life to influence you. And I think that my current mentor and close friend, Dewey Freeman, says that power is the ability to influence and be influenced. That power is a reciprocal dynamic. And so I think for many of us as men, we're seeking to try and find a sense of power. But to have a mentorship means that we are going to be inherently influenced. And that can be a very threatening thing for a man, to know that he's putting himself in a position of allowing himself to be so deeply influenced by another man. And so I think I'll shift personally. That was something that I was sort of craving. I grew up, I had two family systems. My parents divorced when I was 3. My dad remarried when I was 5. My mom remarried when I was 6. They both had a daughter with these other people when I was 7. They both had a son when I was 10 and 11. So I grew up between these two family systems, and I had, a wonderful grandfather who was in my life and taught me a lot. And so I really valued that type of older masculine wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And it was something that I was open to and sought because I knew the value of it. And so when my life sort of fell apart, this mentor of mine had been in my life prior. I had met him a few times before in my previous career. And it was one of those things where I opened up to him and confided in him about what had been going on. And it's almost like he sort of knew that there was this relationship that was unfolding. But I think one of the things that was very helpful was that I was just deeply curious about the wisdom that I could feel from him. There was something tangible about it that felt safe and nourishing and felt like a kind of gift to me that I hadn't really felt before. And So I had this sort of sense enough to follow that. You know, it wasn't rational. It definitely wasn't the rational thing to do at the time or the logical thing to do. But there was just this sort of gut sense of you need to spend as much time with this man as possible, because there's something that he has to offer. And in many ways, I think it was the wisdom of an elder, you know, like a real elder. And I think those are sometimes in our modern culture few and far between. But I think it was the curiosity was part of it. I think the other part was I was okay with being in this position of the mentee, you know, of being influenced by somebody in that capacity and trusting somebody in that way. It felt very healing for me. And I gained so much, you know, out of that dynamic. And so I think those were some of the prerequisites in terms of how, you know, how I fit, like the logistics of it, right? I mean, like I said, he was in my life prior. I think it is very challenging to find a mentor. I think you know, there's sort of the cliche sayings of like, when the student is ready, the master will appear and that kind of stuff. And I do think that there's a certain level of fate and serendipity that plays into finding somebody who can guide us and be that guide. And I've had a number of mentors that have come into my life over the years since then that, you know, have just sort of found their way onto my doorstep. But I think that it's my inherent internal curiosity to seek out that type of wisdom, rather than the just sort of over accumulation of knowledge and information that we can kind of get trapped in within our modern culture. So I think those are some of the ingredients, that we can embody when we want to move towards that, if it's something that interests us.
Yeah, that really speaks to me, and I deeply appreciate how you've articulated it. My lived experience has brought me to kind of the same observation, but in a really different context, because I've been coaching couples since 2013, and I've learned so much from the men that I've coached. One of the things that I've also learned this from my husband and 3 sons. I have 4 children, but 3 of them are sons. So I've had an opportunity to see how some things feel universal and some are really individual in how they express. But in any case, I feel like in our society, men are profoundly misunderstood. And when I'm talking, let's say, with marketers or different people, they just always assume that the majority of people who reach out to me are women because women care about relationships, women tend the marriages, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, that isn't true. It was initially true, but I think there are a bunch of different reasons why that's not true, why there are a lot of men who reach out to me. And I think one of the reasons is because in my own way, similar to you, I blend a certain bite-sized, sequential, logical way of communicating while definitely moving in and acknowledging what on your podcast I've heard you refer to as the mystery, you know, the things that are hard to quantify, but instead of having relationships be this large black box, that one can actually open it and systematically lean in and grow and feel better and create more authentic emotional connection and more passionate sexual intimacy. That it's both through using our minds and our hearts, through knowing and uncertainty, that we can really expand and enjoy our relationships more. So I'm saying that in my way to just place beside the beautiful ways that you said it. And I think this is a good way to ask the one question that I wanted to make sure to ask you, which is, I want to think about the man who is a, quote, good man. And he's not nasty. He's not narcissistic. Like, it's none of the, quote, toxic masculinity. This is a good man who works hard to provide for his family, who's married to a woman who also is educated, ambitious, working, you know, has purpose in the world outside of the home, and also kind of has the key to the emotional matrix, to the things happening in the family, that she's the one who has more consciously and also just made a bigger contribution to establishing the family culture they share and the marital culture they share. And now here's this man who wants more connection, wants more authenticity, wants to be a more skillful husband, but being his wife's mentee is definitely not the right move, even if she did know how to do that with respect and not with blame and criticism. So how does a good guy find his voice in the marriage that he's co-created?
Yeah. Well, I would say that there's a few things, just having worked with so many men on this exact on this exact thing over the last decade.
It's so prevalent. And I think a lot of the men navigating this don't have the words to articulate it, and their wives don't have the perception to appreciate it either. But anyway, please continue.
Well, I think that socially, many of us as men have bought into this idea and this spoken or unspoken notion that to be a good man and a good husband is to get the validation of our partner. And so that the metrics that we actually try and follow, which is largely false, but the metrics that we largely try and follow are given by our partners, right? So verifying, yes, you're a good man. Yes, you're doing the right things. Yes, you're
or no, you're
right
not,
things.
Which comes very frequently too.
Right. Yeah.
In loving, committed, happy marriages.
Yeah. And so part of what needs to happen is the pulling away from, or the creating some space. Like Jung had this great saying where he said, you cannot heal what you cannot separate from. And so part of what we need to do is create a little bit of space between us and our partner's validation, not between us and our partner, but between us and our partner's validation, that their word is the word of whether or not we're a good man relationally. And when we do that, then we have the opportunity to see, okay, who am I being in the context of this relationship? How am I actually showing up? Am I tolerating things that I don't want to tolerate? Am I engaging in ways that I don't enjoy, like, or appreciate? Are there things that are missing from my life outside of this relationship that actually might add to and sharpen me as a man, as an individual, so that I have more capacity within this relationship? So we as men can get so externally focused on our partner, on the relationship, on the family, that we slowly lose sight of who we are, what we desire, what we want. And I think that's one of the great misunderstandings of men relationally, is that we try and be successful and win in the relationship by almost losing connection with who we are and becoming what we think the relationship needs, what we think our partner needs and our kid needs and everything like that. When in actuality, there will come a point in any relationship or marriage where a man actually needs to step away from that and start to become ultimately who he needs himself to be. And in doing that, again, there's a kind of nourishment and energy that he then brings back into the relationship. So that's one part. And the second part is that he likely needs to do all of that with and alongside other men. There's a lot of data and research that's showing that, men are more isolated than ever before. Young men, old men, just everybody, right? The average man has less male friends than ever before. It's like 15 to 20% of men can't identify a best friend, right? I mean, that's a large number of men. And then you have men who only have one close friend that they rely on. And so I think one of the things is, yes, we need to be able to sort of go out and venture into the territory of who do we want to be. and how do we want to develop ourselves, and what skills do we want to develop, whether that's in communication or sexually, or just, being able to go on a meditation retreat or go out into nature and spend a few nights out in nature camping underneath the stars. But that there's also value in building strong masculine bonds, and that those relationships will become this sort of practice and testing ground of everything that you'll bring back into your relationship. That having and being challenged by other men in your life will then benefit your marriage and relationship, because your partner won't be the only source of challenging you, right? To better yourself, to sharpen your edge. So I think that those are the two elements I've noticed for a lot of men. Oftentimes it's the act of getting around other men who are doing this similar work, who are on this similar journey and adventure, that becomes very healing, but also very aspirational and inspirational, because many of us as men, we learn through modeling. It's why a lot of guys learn better by being able to see somebody do what they're trying to learn, right? Whether that's mathematics or psychology or, being an electrician, like whatever it is. Most of us learn very well by seeing how somebody's doing it. Yeah, pornography, right? That's why it's very sort of popular amongst men, maybe more so than women. So yeah, and then when you're around other men, there's this stripping bare of if you're in the right space with men, right? Not in the sort of like, we're at the bar having beers, just talking about sports, but we're in a depth conversation about the struggles that are transpiring within our marriage, or the insecurities that we feel sexually in the bedroom. I mean, if you can have conversations with other men about those things and confront them around other men, there is a kind of release of the insecurity and a release of the pressure that begins to take place, and an emboldening of the type of behaviors that we ultimately want to bring back into our marriage.
Yeah, it's really good to hear. And I have a lot of different thoughts about it. One that comes to mind in this moment is I actually feel the same way about couples work. I have a program, the Aligned in Hot Marriage live coaching program, which is an amazing journey and context, as well as education and curriculum and live coaching. And I take about 4 to 6 couples through it at a time. But most couples who've got their lives together think of their relationship as so private and so, in this sense, precious. And it is precious and it is private, of course, but our culture just hasn't provided context for people to understand how exponentially effective and more rapid and more gratifying the growth can be when the couple is doing their own work, but it's in the context of witnessing others and sharing with others. And I think in our society in general, while there are many isolated women, we have a much deeper appreciation for how that would be true for women. I really love how you've shared about how that's true for men. And I'll just add that it's also true for couples. It's not just men who learn through imitation. We're all mammals. And that is absolutely the main way we learn about relationships. Every guest that I have on the show, I ask the same question, which is based on my conviction that intimate relationships are the ultimate vehicle for personal growth. So this is a question I ask couples when both people are there, but I'm going to ask you, what have you learned about yourself as a result of being married to your wife?
So much. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with your sentiment entirely. Jung had this saying, he said that marriage is the fastest horse in the race of individuation.
Yeah.
right? And so if we want to find a sense of wholeness, we find it in relationship. And there's many other, versions of that. Like we're hurt in relationships, and so we need to heal in relationships. But for me, I've learned a number of things. I think one of the main ones is like when we started dating, she's this amazing therapist. And when we started dating, things were great. And we were, going back and forth. We were doing long distance. I lived in Vancouver. She lived in New York. And so I'd come here, she'd go there. And after probably about 6 or 7 months, some disagreements and conflicts started to show up. And we did conflict very differently. I grew up in a household where conflict was either not there in my one house where it was just completely avoided, or in the other house, it was loud, volatile, and violent. And so I didn't like conflict. It was something that I had kind of avoided in past relationships in a number of different ways. But she grew up in a house where that was not the case, where conflict was like the sixth love language, it's like how they, she grew up in Jersey, and it was like conflict was one of those things where they sorted their problems out, and they weren't afraid to disagree, and
it didn't mean the relationship was on the line.
Yeah, it didn't mean the relationship was on the line, but there was too much of it. It was pretty consistent between her and both of her parents.
I see.
And so these conflicts and these disagreements started to come up in the relationship. And I started to notice how avoidant I was of wanting to engage with it. And so I started to do things that would just try and shut it down, right? Disprove what she was saying, invalidating how she's feeling, all the wrong things, right? And I knew that these were all the wrong things. I could see myself doing it. I'm like, well, I would probably tell a client not to say what I just said, And so, but it really was one of these things where I had this sort of fear behind the scenes of being very sort of grounded and rooted and assertive and direct, and creating this sort of cliche thing to say, but creating room or space for her to be emotional without needing to engage in the logistics of the content that was coming forward. Because my wife is, when she gets upset, I love her and I respect her so much. And one of the things I love and respect about her, she's fierce. She's got a real fire to her. And so when conflict arises, she used to get into this very sort of ferocious place of trying to prove her point. And it was like dealing with a lawyer. And I just, I don't, that's not exactly where I wanted to be. And so I would push back on that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I started to really learn about myself was that I would get dysregulated. I was not comfortable in the face of, especially a woman getting assertive, getting very direct, being upset, being angry at me. I wasn't okay with it. And it wasn't that I wasn't okay with it because I didn't think that she should be acting that way. It's that I wasn't okay with it because my nervous system literally just couldn't handle it. And so I had to really practice grounding and breathing and centering and being okay with her energy in the moment of conflict. Because it wasn't that I didn't like what she was saying. She wasn't doing anything or saying anything abusive or harmful or any of those things. It's just that I felt so uncomfortable with the conflict because how I had dealt with conflict in the past was, again, either it was avoidant or it was violent. And so I didn't know how to stay in that space and ground myself. And so that's one of the big pieces that I think our marriage and our relationship has done for me, is that I've really learned how to ground in the face of conflict. And it's deepened my capacity for sure as a practitioner. Because it was very interesting. I had, working with men and working with their anger or their volatility or these big emotions that sometimes come out, no problem regulating under those circumstances and staying grounded and rooted. But when my wife would get upset with me, all of a sudden, I would feel sort of jarred. So that's one of the big pieces. Um, I think the other thing is, and I'm just trying to frame this one, but I think the other thing is being with Vienna, her name's Vienna, being with Vienna has asked me or sort of demanded me to trust in myself in a deeper way because she is she's very committed to her values, and she's very loyal, and she's just exceptional, sort of first chair violinist in high school and college, Division 1 lacrosse player, top of her class in college, top of her class in her master's degree. And that wasn't me. I was terrible academically. I almost didn't graduate high school. I was an average hockey player. And so when we got together, she really saw the best in me. And she just kept mirroring that back of like, she really had this deep belief in me. And I was reminded of this saying that my first mentor said to me when I was sort of at the bottom of my confidence and self-value. He said, sometimes all of us need somebody to believe in us more than we believe in ourselves.
Yes.
And he really did that for me. And what I realized is that I had never really had that in a partnership. I had never had a relationship where the woman that I was with believed in me more than I believed in myself. And she did. She really did. And so it asked me to step into a stronger, more capable, more competent, more robust, more responsible version of myself. The sort of version of myself that I knew I could become, but I was scared of pursuing because I wasn't really sure if it was possible. So I think those are, not to sort of say that nonchalantly, but I think that those are the two things that really come to mind when you ask the question. And they're very substantial. And as a result of it, I've learned, like, one of the things that I always tell men is find a relationship with a woman that you can do conflict with, that you're willing to engage in conflict with, because it's not that we want to create a relationship where there's no conflict. It's that we want to become more masterful in our capacity to move through it and to resolve it and to repair it.
And to use it to create connection rather than disconnection.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I will give you an opportunity to share how people can find you and whatever you'd like to share about your book and your programs and so forth. But before that question, I'm feeling the women listening who are thinking to themselves, I really want my husband to move towards that, to find a mentor, to find a men's group, to, let's even just say work with you. It doesn't matter for my question which of those options it is. What's the best way for her? Well, what should she do with that desire? Because there's a way in which it goes against what's possible if she tells him to go find a mentor, or he does it because she's told him. I mean, that doesn't undermine what's possible with the mentor, but it means that the whole thing is happening in a dynamic which goes against the goal. So I wonder if you could speak to the women yearning for this for their men, whether they're aware or not aware of how much they're actually making it hard for them to get there. That's not important. They can still really want that.
Yeah. Yeah, I get asked this a lot in different ways, right? How do I encourage my husband to work with you? How do I encourage my husband to go to a men's weekend or to join a men's group or just to do this work? And I do think that there's a couple, different pathways, and it is sort of relationship dependent, and it is sort of individual, dependent on the dynamic and the man. But I think there's a couple ways. One, Depending on your relationship, you can provide resources, right? Men we just like to do stuff and we like to listen to stuff. And so there's no harm, if you have that type of relationship with your partner where he's open to checking out a podcast or checking out a book or, something along those lines. For years, I've said, women are in a lot of relationships, women are the permission card holder for a man to enter into this work. Now, that doesn't mean that he should choose to do it for her, but she can be the conduit or the vehicle that calls him into it, which can be a very beautiful gift. So one is what I would say is if you have that dynamic, feel free, buy him the book, get him, send him a podcast and say, hey, check this out, but do it without expectations and demands. It's not something that he has to do. If you tell them that he has to do it, then he's either doing it for you or he's naturally going to want to resist it. It's just the way that we work as human beings.
Either way, you don't get what you wanted.
Yes. Thank you for that, Caveat. Yes. That's an important one. So I would say share resources. Two is get curious, ask questions about how does he view his own work and development? Who is he wanting to become? One of the best things that a woman can do for her partner is to help him kind of flush out and define who he's wanting to become. What kind of father is he wanting to become? What kind of husband is he wanting to become? And so to elicit and ask questions of what are you working on these days? And what do you feel like your priorities are? And what really matters to you lately? These types of questions are going to help a man just sort of think about what is a priority for me right now? What am I working on? So that's the next piece. And then the last piece is, I would say, reinforcement. When you see your partner starting to move in some of these directions, getting curious, following an Instagram page or listening to a podcast and sort of dropping it oh yeah, listen to this. And it was really interesting. Reinforce with gratitude and appreciation. Do not underestimate the potency that appreciation can have. I always say that appreciation is the currency of intimacy in a relationship. And that just goes a long way to, especially for a man to step into this type of work when he might be hesitant or unsure of the results or the outcome. And so I would just say, reinforce it, share praise, share appreciation, share gratitude, don't validate and say, yeah, you're doing the right thing, but share the appreciation of, I love that you're doing that for yourself. I love that you're exploring this. I find it really attractive, or however that really is true for you as his partner. Share what it's like for you to observe him moving in that direction. And I think that will go a tremendously long way.
I really love the last point, and I'm just going to add to it that I think it's really valuable for every woman to develop a sense of what it feels like to her to express appreciation, praise, reinforcement in a way that is really different than how you do that with your 5-year-old son when he washes his hands before the meal or something like that. And even if it's the same words, that the place in you from which that flows, be the woman, the wife, the erotic, loving person. I don't mean it needs to be a sexy, flirtatious communication. In fact, maybe not. Maybe it'd be better if it isn't. Either way, that it's really helpful to get clear that we don't want to be parenting our spouses if we want them to show up for us in the way that would be the case for any woman making this recommendation. So I just want to tag that on to what you've said and invite you to share how people can follow you. You have a new book, which just looks incredible. What would you like people to know?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. And I mean, the book is called Men's Work, and you can find it on my website, mantalks.com, or my Instagram, mantalks. And, I think it's a really great access point for any man doing the work. I kind of designed it to be the book. My hope is that it's the book that coaches, therapists, counselors recommend and men go and read, because it's chock full of questions and actual work for them to do. And it's been really wonderfully received thus far. And I've been shocked that couples have been going through it together, which has been wonderful. I've gotten a ton of messages from women who have said that they've learned so much about men from reading the book and about their partners. So it's not just exclusively for men. I'll just say that. But that's the big one. You can check out my work, my offerings at mantalks.com, the podcast, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Excellent. And I'll just say, I have a client, a couple I've been coaching for a number of months, and he's read Men's Work, and just it really lit a particular flavor of fire in him. And I'm excited for all the men who will read your book and the relationships that will benefit accordingly. So anything else you want to say before we close, Connor?
Just thank you. And I like the format. This was fun. I've been doing a lot of podcasts with the book tour, and this is very enjoyable. So I appreciate it.
Well, I'm so glad, and I've had a lot going on in my head while we've been talking. Just so excited for a lot of particular people, men and women, to hear this interview, as well as enjoying the conversation with you. So thank you very much. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to leave the Intimate Marriage Podcast a 5-star rating and review. And if you want fun, effective instruction on how to create a lifelong, passionate marriage, the Aligned and Hot Marriage Program was created for you. This is my signature program, and it contains all the best practices I have developed. I've applied them in my own marriage with great success, and seen how helpful they are for the hundreds of couples I have coached. The Aligned and Hot Marriage Program will give you everything you need to transform your marriage, turn it on, and feel more connected than ever in just 8 weeks. Go to alignedhotmarriage.com and get started today.